welcome back to, well, what is functionally today the, 85th day of reInvent, or damn near feels like it. It's like they took a look at Groundhog Day, combined it with Hanukkah, and then figured out what they could do to make both of those things even worse. I'm joined today by Jim Walker, who is theoretically a VP of product marketing over at Cockroachdb, but I assume it's close to being an exterminator. Welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Corey. I'm happy to be here.
Now, I don't know much about Cockroachdb. I mean, I hear it's a database. I hear some people like it. I know it's absolutely not going to be able to touch the majesty of the proper database, Route 53. But tell me a little bit about it. What is a Cockroachdb? I love the name. It sounds like that even after the bombs fall / AWS finishes acquiring the entire landscape, it'll still be there. But that's basically all I can gather from it from a high-level naming perspective.
Yeah, so funny enough, when it was originally just an open source project that our founder had started. Actually, our three founders, Spencer Kimball, Peter Madison, Ben Darnell, and actually Spencer and Peter are pretty well known. They started the GIMP project, which is 30 years old now, right? So they're just real big open source guys. And when Spencer was naming the project, they living in New York. Cockroaches are part of your life, and we've designed a database and we've architected and built a database that's really difficult to kill, and so it seemed appropriate to Spencer at the time to name the project Cockroach Database, and that's really kind of the genesis of the name. Now, the genesis of the product itself comes from Google, funny enough, and so they have a product called Spanner, which is a pretty popular distributed database. Being open source and available to all, they published a white paper about it, and really Cockroach is descendant of that white paper. So all the core principles, distributed systems, but applied to a database and applied to a relational database, a database that's good enough for kind of system of record type workloads. It can hold money. It's not going to lose data. And so, but being distributed and kind of cloud neutral and being able to take advantage of scale, deliver on the resilience and the global availability that I think a lot of applications need today, especially out of a relational database, and just kind of re-envision that and re-architect and rebuild from the ground up to be distributed. And that's really kind of the core principles around Cockroach.
So every database, it seems, specializes in certain things. I would also challenge you on the idea that it can store money because it doesn't lose data. HSBC was very public about consolidating a whole bunch of relational databases into MongoDB, whose core value proposition is, in fact, losing your data when you don't want it to. So there is an argument to be made in favor of different databases for different use cases and sometimes being wildly inappropriate for it. Going back to the Spanner paper, to my understanding, the entire thesis of that was, here's how we can completely ignore cap theorem because we are smarter than you. It has that sort of condescension tone that more or less most things out of Google seem to. And the way that it did it, if memory serves, was having highly accurate clocks in data centers. I get the sense that when I wind up buying Cockroach, you're going to ship me software, not atomic clocks in a box, presumably. So how does it wind up achieving similar guarantees?
That's right. And funny, the cap theorem and being kind of the intelligentsia that actually wants to attack that, that's exactly what we're designed for. And you talk about consistency of data. You started there with the eventually consistent, I call it casually consistent databases, where you're just going to lose data. It's just casually consistent means it's not right. We erred on two things. Number one was serializable isolation, which within a database is the highest level of guaranteed consistency. And then the other side was the other battle, or our ultimate competition, I always feel, is just the speed of light. Because when you're distributed and you're dealing with these things, how do you actually get this stuff available everywhere? And I think that's what the Spanner paper kind of outlines, some of those things. Now, Google and the way that they implement things is they do look at like the optimal way of doing that. And an atomic clock is actually a pretty interesting thing because you can guarantee time within 5 milliseconds or so, whatever that's going to be based on some hardware that's in a physical machine. What we've done is we've re-architected that part of the design so that we're relying on basically kind of like network time protocol type stuff. NTP has been around for 30, 40 years. But then incorporating logical drift to that within each of the nodes so that we aren't tied to any hardware. You can run it on any cloud, on any, I could spin it up on this laptop and it will stay in sync within like about 100 milliseconds or so. I forget what the exact limit is right now, but it's going to stay within a reasonable amount of time, because yes, time is really, really important when you're doing things at global scale.
Yeah, I suck at preparation for these things, so you'd think I would know the answers off the top of my head. I assure you, if you're listening or watching this, it's not staged. Is it API compatible with Spanner? Or sorry, with Cloud Spanner, the version that they like to sell by the gigabyte hour pound or whatever it is that they're metering it on?
Gigabyte hour, yeah, no, it's not. And so for us, we are wire compatible with Postgres. That was a decision we made very early on, which is a diversion from the Spanner white paper. I think the Spanner white paper gave us some architectural principles to build on, but we built from the ground up the entire thing in Go. And we chose very early on to be wire compatible with Postgres, so that it is familiar for developers to get up and running. It is going to work with a lot of the tools that you already have. We're building ORMs that are very similar to these communities that people like to use. The developer friendliness thing is just such a big piece of the overall approach to what we're doing. This is just a relational database. It just looks like SQL to everybody, and then wire compatible. So like API compatible to Google, we're going to run on Google Cloud, and we're going to run on Kubernetes, but we're also going to run in EC2 and EKS and wherever you want to run. And so for us, being kind of cloud neutral or cloud agnostic was the key part of our strategy, yet familiar with the developer.
One of the philosophies that I've always held is that API compatibility is nice, but I like having a particular, I guess, exodus strategy when it comes down to what am I going to do if I have to move something somewhere else. I don't believe in building workloads in a cloud agnostic way, but I do like having an exodus strategy that doesn't require me to completely rethink my architecture from square one.
Right.
So historically, I look at something like Cloud Spanner. It's great. I like it. I wouldn't build my core application around it because migrating off is challenging. I feel similarly, though I love it, about DynamoDB. It's very tricky to get something like that in any other environment if I need to move it down the road. So with that in mind, how do you approach this? You mentioned that it's Postgres compatible. Let's get a little bit into some of the announcements that we've heard about over the past couple of weeks that are, I guess, shall we say, extensive across the board. Today, I want to focus more on databases because A, I know very little about them, and two, as a white man in tech, there's absolutely nothing more gratifying to me than being confidently incorrect about things.
I too am confidently incorrect about everything, but I just come off with as much confidence as I possibly can, Corey. I've learned from some of the best on that one. Funny enough, this is one of those areas where you and I disagree, and I'm a follower of your Twitter stream and everything you do, because I think you have some really, really incredible insight. But I am a believer in things like multi-cloud. I do think it is a future of what we're actually able to do. In fact, Cockroach database right now, we can run it. We can run a single logical database that spans multiple public, private, whatever you want, and it just appears to be one database. It's one API. And you have access across multiple different environments. I could spin a node up on this laptop pointed at a cluster that's running in AWS, and it'll participate in that cluster. It'll be able to service queries against that database. So we truly can actually implement a multi-cloud database, which I find really, really interesting. More importantly, I think, that's less important, I think, today. I think in the hybrid deployment models, that becomes really important. People do want data that lives on-prem and in the cloud. But I think more importantly, this concept of being able to eliminate the risk of actually moving something eventually. Look, if data has gravity, it's not how likely that people are going to move huge workloads. It's difficult. It's risky to migrate between one environment to the next, let alone the migration of the database itself. These things, but the risk profile based on workload is going to dictate certain things do get moved, and some companies just aren't comfortable with that risk associated with being tied into a particular provider, a technology, whatever that's going to be. And I think that's kind of one of those things that the industry battles today a lot. There's a lot of conversations about that.
First, thank you for sponsoring this episode. It is appreciated. Lord knows it takes money to pull off these shiny backgrounds and amazing hairstyles that I've been rocking. But because I have no sense of self-preservation or where money comes from, I'm going to argue with you on the point. I think multi-cloud on a different workload, a different division basis makes a lot of sense. I think that workloads trying to span multiple clouds often is not required, and when people try to do it, they're exposing themselves to they're not effectively mitigating a single point of failure, they're introducing additional single points of failure in practice.
Right.
It seems like the API equivalence between providers is never great. You're forced to rely on third-party shims in some ways to make them look sort of the same, but the underlying behavior is different. It's fun because we can argue about this, but what I say and what you say doesn't actually matter. It's what customers say and what customers decide to do. And I think this is going to be a great 10 years from now, we have a discussion and one of us is going to owe the other an apology. I just don't know which way it's going to go yet.
No, there's zero apologies in this conversation because none of us know how this is going to work out. And I think we are such an early stage of this entire kind of like, what does it mean to be global? What does it mean for organizations to actually, is the cloud a global asset for organizations? Are companies running things in multiple different regions? I mean, forget about like different cloud providers, Corey. Let's just talk about, multi-region applications and how difficult that is to do. And I think the cloud providers are trying to make that easier and easier to do from the compute layer and the raw stuff. For us, we abstract that away and are going to run on any of those environments and make it as simple as possible because we actually control a different layer of the infrastructure and it's data. And so if I can give a consistent API that is going to run across these different regions, and then within the database itself, deal with the latency issues that you're going to run into between regions. Deal with the consistency problems that you're going to have when a transaction is going to come in New York and a transaction comes in Singapore and it's on the same account and you're a bank. Which of those transactions win? Those are really, really difficult problems to solve. And so for us, we felt that abstracting that complexity to the database itself makes sense. Beyond that, look, we could start talking about compliance and where data lives. And so another key characteristic, what I think the future of the database holds is that I think all data needs time and location. We've built location into our database, so we can tie data to a location. That's one of the ways that we deal with this inherent latency problem when you're dealing with like global workloads. Funny enough, it really helps when people want to comply with regulations. I can now, tie all German records to German servers so I can comply with GDPR or whatever kind of these regulatory compliance issues. I think this is why I think there's no right or wrong answer here, because the complications on all this stuff is endless. I technically, can we do some of these things? I absolutely know we can. In fact, I'm going to set up a multi-cloud database, and I'm going to tweet at you with this thing and just say it's so easy, a marketing guy can do it. Because I mean, geez, you get paid. I'm just a marketing guy, dude. Like, come on, right? Like, who am I in this game?
Yeah, just a marketing guy. Yeah, that's one of those phrases I hate because I sort of backed up my way into that role myself, and it's harder than it looks, as I'm sure you can attest. So a few comments from the chat. First, the questions as well. First, someone's asking why I'm blinking so much. Yeah, I don't think you realize how many lights I'm staring into when I do this. I also don't think you realize how little I sleep and how at this point I'm running on caffeine and prayers. So yeah, it's a weird year. Someone else pointed out that someone else asked why AWS hasn't copied your product into RDS yet. Now, my personal theory is that you're not paying to be a high enough partner tier member where they attempt to kill you in the night, such as Snowflake would be. But what's your thought on that?
It's early days of distributed SQL and distributed databases, and I think honestly, AWS has an approach already with Aurora. That's what they think of as scale. I think that's scale within a single region, which is interesting. It still doesn't scale for writes. It's still a single node for writes. And we'll see where AWS goes. But it seems that their focus is mostly within Aurora when you start to think about scale out relational database. That said, we took a radical different approach from an open source point of view. We changed our licensing to be, and you'll see other vendors have done this as well. We changed it to something called the business source license, which basically is everything I've done in open source for years and years in terms of how the end user can actually consume this. We just actually restrict that nobody can take our software and charge for it as a service and deliver it as a service. And those limitations are 3 years past the date of release. So we gave it a time, and we said that's the one kind of use case or work that we actually limit people from actually doing. So we took those steps.
In some ways, in some ways, by doing that, you're giving another gift to the open source community. You're giving a bunch of engineers an excuse to once again attempt to cosplay as lawyers. And it's always entertaining to see those debates rage on Slashdot and IRC and other places of yesteryear. There's a whole debate we can have on that. It's an area I don't tend to know a lot about, and I wind up out of my depth super quickly. So I mostly tend to stay away from it. Other comments from the chat, people are mentioning that Route 53, my preferred database, is not multi-cloud. Well, DNS absolutely is. If DNS isn't working, neither is anything else. And we can argue that point later. Then a question for you, because I don't know the answer. Always fun asking people these things live. Are there any large commercial user stories or case studies for CockroachDB?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. In fact, we are well entrenched in some of the larger financial services companies that you would expect are going down this path. Across media and entertainment and gaming, there's not a vertical that we're not in. And I think they're all struggling to meet the needs of consumers, especially from a scale point of view, and kind of these always-on systems. Some of those that are kind of more, I guess, vocal or public on our website, like the Comcasts of the world, and smaller companies like LaunchDarkly. DoorDash is a great customer of ours. eBay. There's several. They're listed on our website. There's a bunch of them. So.
Yeah, the small little companies like those. People aren't often aware of this, but before this, my last real job was in big finance at a company called BlackRock that most folks I've either never heard of or have a dramatically strange idea of what they do. And having worked in environments like that, the fact that you have large finance customers who are doing this, I know exactly what you're saying when you say stuff like that, because one, you're never going to get logo or testimonial rights from those folks. I don't know how AWS managed to pull it off with Capital One and a few other folks and FINRA. Two, how do I put this? Their understanding of the cloud is radically different than that of most other companies, where you have discussions with auditors at these places, and then they quite seriously and insistently talk about when they can tour US East 1. And it becomes a back and forth, and it's unfortunate because they're used to getting their way. And even if you give in, AWS doesn't, not for lack of trying, but they don't. And it becomes this very challenging discussion to have. So being able to get a product and a customer deployed in an environment like that is no joke. If nothing else, at least as a 10-person consultancy on my side where we fix the AWS bill, it's great. We're still looking at, in some cases, 9 months just to pass the procurement gates at shops like that. And you can speed it up somehow when you're saving the money. You realize every month that you're not bringing us in, you're losing, and fill in the number here. It becomes a little bit of an accelerator, but it's harder to convince people in procurement of the value of improving their database posture or their technology solution. Will it make the printer start working better because I'm having problems with the printer?
Right.
Anything beyond that, it just sounds like an excuse. And it's the cross-divisional communication here.
That's right. And you think procurement's tough, Corey. Try security in these large financial services institutions. And so, going through that process with the FinServ companies, to me, and as a member of Cockroach, to go through that with them has helped us enormously, because if we can go through security, a process with them, are we going to be able to get through that with every other large enterprise company? And so for me, it's a huge value as well, because it teaches as a small company how to actually build things and how to get through this stuff. I mean, it is actually public that JPMC actually chose us as a inductee to their Hall of Innovation this year. So not only are we able to work within there, they look at us as a very innovative product. I think the other companies in the class, I think HashiCorp was in it this year, and we're just crazy honored to be in that, because they are looking at us as a technology that is innovative, that they will start to build their future on and look at in that way. And that huge honor, but it just shows kind of there's a lot of obstacles you got to get through to get there, though.
Yeah, there's a couple comments in the chat now, even about this. When you started talking about this, someone said, as a finance person, I won't be allowed to use a cloud database as a service if I can't control the encryption keys and rotation, which is why AWS usually wins. And then there turns into a bit of a game of one-upsmanship where someone says, we can't access GitHub, and someone else says, we can, but it's read-only GitHub for us. And it's almost like going back in time. Is Cockroach, you mentioned obviously it's a open source / source available / don't email me license, but so it's obviously something you can deploy in your own environment. Is there also a managed service offering?
Yes, absolutely. And so all the above we can handle, and however you want to extend it or work within the context of the way that we deal with certificate. We work with lots of different companies to deal with those sort of things, but we have Cockroach Cloud, which kind of sounds fun, right? Like, it just by itself is just a great term, Cockroach Cloud. But yeah, that is us running it as a managed service. You choose your cloud provider it's running on, and we manage that and deploy and upgrade. And we have a team of incredible SREs that are working on this stuff. And it's taught us a lot about how we run things as well. Actually, the entire thing runs on Kubernetes, and it's really helped us kind of learn a lot about how our database interacts with that environment and what scale really means to organizations. So yeah, we're running Cockroach Cloud today, and it is kind of the main thrust of our strategy. That's where we hope most customers land. But we understand if you want to run on-prem because there's certain things about cloud that I have to control, yeah, well, we're going to work within that context as well.
Yeah, one more question was that whether we think the market is moving to NoSQL. My take on that is it depends on who you're talking to. There are still companies that are looking to migrate off of mainframes and onto x86 style architectures just in time to miss the transition to ARM. And virtualization is still new and scary. Is there a trend in that direction? Absolutely. And I've been doing some stuff there. And this is sort of one of the theses I wanted to talk to you about is Aurora serverless solves a lot of the reasons I never went with RDS or anything that was a managed offering for other things that I was doing from a relational perspective, just because it was expensive and you had to have these things running all the time just to return data. So that's something where I just pay for consumption is huge. But what do you think? Do you think that the world is moving away from relational?
Absolutely not moving away from relational. I will fight that one to my death with that's 20, 30 years from now. And I don't think that's going away. Look, man, I learned SQL when I graduated my computer engineering degree in the early 90s, right? And so it's not going away. Like that's the language we use. And while NoSQL is interesting, you're not like in a document database, you're not going to be able to handle transactions. Like a system of record workload is not going to work in a document database. You need to re-architect from the ground up to get that type of scale. And that's exactly what's going on. That said, it's still early days in kind of this new approach, right? Like, because you know how things work. Over time, as an industry, we just get smarter and smarter, and new approaches come along. And so the relational database has been fantastic for 30 or 35 years, or whatever that is, and we build workloads on these things. However, technology is also moving at a pace, and as software engineering, I feel has accelerated over the last 5 to 10 years. And we have figured out some of the issues and what's holding us back in these relational databases. I mean, why do we have this weird primary, secondary, 2 data center thing, where you have this huge monolithic database running on hardware and it's so expensive to run, dude? Like, and talking about, serving the reason for serverless. Why do we even do that? You know how expensive those things are? It's ill-fated, and it will change over time. It just takes time. It's early days of this new approach. Coming back to serverless, though, I completely share that vision. I think databases can be deployed in a way that they can intelligently be spun up and spun down based on transactional volume, based on storage, what you want to do. But I will extend the vision of serverless beyond a single data center and beyond a single node, scaling that one kind of component up and down to being global. And I think in fact, I know there's a way to do it because I see our engineers are working on it and I know what we're doing. And so to be truly serverless, I think there's another vector that comes into this. It's beyond up and down, and it's scale out in terms of global coverage as well. And how do you do that? That's a really difficult problem to solve. I believe that's the future of the database. What becomes basically, we basically abstract the entire database down to a SQL API in the cloud, where it's just a connection string. And no matter where I'm at on the planet, I'm going to be guaranteed, under 100 millisecond latency all the time, hopefully under 10 millisecond latency on that data, no matter where it is. And I think that gets really interesting for all reads and writes across the entire planet. And so, my vision of serverless extends a little bit beyond just the scale up in terms of, transactional volume, which I think, V2 has gone along. I think what the team has done at AWS is serverless V2. It's definitely the logical next step for what they're doing. And I think it's a huge cost savings for people who are interested in that approach right now.
When Aurora Serverless first came out, I was excited about it. And the problem is I did some experimentation with it and pretty quickly determined it wasn't for me for a variety of reasons. It was slow to spin up. It was expensive. It was still a lot of caring about things where it feels like that, much like people do with Kubernetes, they wanted to pour the word serverless over something and wind up getting mind share as a result. And then in typical AWS form, sometimes you can get clues from the name. And when they call something V2, it's generally their approach at unscrewing a pooch when they got it really wrong the first time. And to be fair, most of the problems I had with it are now vanishing with the V2 model. It's effectively instant on and not having this minimum runtime for it. It's originally, even in V1, this is designed for either low traffic or development workloads. And whenever you see that in the formal documentation for something, you can tell that there was a giant political fight behind the scenes of, yes, it's cool and yes, we want to sell it, but it's actively dangerous for an awful lot of workloads. The fact that that's not there anymore tells me that there's at least a vote of confidence or a lost political fight inside of AWS. But I'm curious to start kicking the tires on this next year and see not only what I can do with it, which is guaranteed to be horrible, but what other people who actually know what they're doing can. Personally, I want to see if there's a way that I can turn it into a DNS server.
Right, and I find it to be interesting what they're doing, and they fixed the consumption model part of it in terms of because serverless to them was you're going to double capacity based on what you have, and you don't want to double capacity. What happens when you have huge capacity? And so it's V2 just basically allows them to be much more granular in the amount of automation in terms of increased capacity or decreased capacity. But again, that's only one vector, and they're using a legacy database. So it's going to be restricted to a single data center at all times. And so while I appreciate the term serverless, to me, it's more automated scale. It's I guess you don't have to pick out, instance types, but, I don't, it's not the true delivery of serverless. It's still a little bit of marketing to me. I mean, serverless to me is you don't have to think about any of that in any way. And I'm going to have access to this data no matter where I'm at on the planet. And so that to me is the full delivery of something I define as serverless, or I guess, the Cockroach team and Spencer and team has really kind of drilled out as a vision. We're extending it to another level. But building on legacy database it's always going to, especially in a distributed cloud-based world, building on a legacy database that was built 30 years ago, it's not always a good fit, man. And especially when it comes out to kind of this elastic scale part and the global availability piece.
Oh yeah, database migrations are always the most painful part of any migration, full stop. What makes me excited about the serverless model applied to it is not that when I stop, it's not charging me anything. I mean, sure, I like that as an individual practitioner or I'm experimenting with something. But the real value to me is when I see it in my customers, where these are large scale companies. And auto scaling has always been understood by these folks to mean scaling something up. And scaling things down never actually really happens. So only paying on a consumption model is transformative for folks who have to scale up for the Black Friday week and then effectively remember to scale down, in April. It doesn't wind up being economical from that perspective. Cutting waste for things that are not being used is valuable. And I think from that perspective, it has a lot of potential. Now, whether or not it winds up continue down the path of building on legacy technology, as you described, or there's a deviation at some point where it modernizes and departs from full compatibility with certain options or whatnot, I don't know. I don't pretend to know. But I am curious to see the continued evolution of it.
And you're right. It's from a production workload point of view, scale up, scale down is where it's what people talk about. you know how many environments get spun up and spun down every day for people to code and to do CI/CD pipelines and to do like that stuff is
Not as
also
many as you think, because you said spun down, and that's the thing people forget to
right,
do. They say they're going to with the best of intentions, but they
right.
retire before their instances do.
That's right. That's right. And how much money is wasted because I just have this instance up and running because I need to run a CI/CD pipeline against it, or like I'm doing some test that only gets run in the middle of the night. Why can't those things be spun down during the middle of the day intelligently and then bought back up online when it starts? And so like that's where we get to really efficient utilization of cloud resources. And I think that's the next frontier of serverless to me, is really starting to attack that part of the angle. Because I think we get lost in production workloads only as an industry, talking about the value. But to me, there's a whole life cycle and there's a whole kind of supply chain of how these tools are used. And talk about number of instances. Well, how many developers do you have? And how does that actually work within your organization? And how do you get really, really efficient in utilization there?
Oh yeah, your AWS bill is not a function of how many customers you have. It's a function of how many engineers you have, like it or not. So the other interesting database announcement that's worth talking about at least briefly is Babelfish, however you want to pronounce it. I don't actually care. It's that's not a pronunciation fight I'm going to have with AWS, but I do wonder. Every time I've seen this attempted before of a real-time translation layer where we're going to have one database but make it look like another, it doesn't generally work very well. The way that they're talking about this, it's transformative and will change the world. And based upon customers I have with hideously expensive Microsoft SQL workloads, this does have the potential to change a lot if it works. Do you think it will?
So number one, and if anybody ever tells you a migration is easy, just you're welcome to do whatever you want to that person, because like never is a migration easy, and I find that to be crazy. And any sort of automated migration, we are way crazy years away from anything that's going to work like that, because it's so complex.
Sure.
Every workload is different, and so I start there. I'm going to come back to something you said earlier too. By the way, I would love to understand what you infer out of this name, Babelfish. I don't get any other names. Okay, the V2, V1. I'll understand that you can infer that out of things, but like I think AWS Handbone's a good one.
Thank you. I would be a great AWS namer, except I'd be fired for competence.
Exactly. So I find this particular announcement interesting because it shows a card of strategy less than the technical advantage. I mean, to me, this is just a shim for them to move workloads from Microsoft to Amazon. And funny enough, it's like, okay, it's also open source. So, it's really a great open source project to get your data into S3 and to manage it and use Aurora around that. And so I find it to be more of a go-to-market strategic move more than anything. I think there's tools that are really, really important, though, that help people with these database migrations. I have not looked into the open source project yet, Corey. That's something on my list over the holiday break to see how applicable it is and what it can actually help with. I'm happy it's open source, though, because if I can actually migrate somebody from SQL Server to a raw Postgres, I love that because I'm ultimately just Postgres. So I like tools that are going to do that. And if they're done in open source, great. And I look forward to kind of investigating it. But I still think it should be valuable because like you said, there's lots of money and lots of workloads wrapped up in SQL Server, DB2, and Oracle.
Absolutely. The name is dumb only insofar as it remains Microsoft SQL to PostgreSQL, which is how I choose to pronounce that word. And that, that's ridiculous and it's overbearing. But if at some point it becomes effectively a real-time translation shim between effectively any two databases, similar to what the DMS, Database Migration Service, can kind of do in some ways, but they started off doing it as a migration service and now it does real-time replication. And once again, AWS names are constraining. That one was too constraining. Babelfish might very well be too forward-looking and too aggressive as far as name goes for what it portends. I don't know. I'm curious to find out because it doesn't matter what database a customer uses from my perspective. I'm going to find a way to mess it up regardless. That is just the way that I work. I stay away from data because unlike a stateless instance or a container that I can reprovision, if I mess up on the database, mistakes will show.
That's right. Interesting enough, you talk about automating migrations, and I think there is some actually pretty interesting technology that's going down this path. Like I said, I need to look at this. But like if you look at like GraphQL servers and what companies like, there's a small company called Prisma that's building out a GraphQL server, basically that can basically automate in real time translations between a request in the backend database. Hasura is doing this sort of thing. I think we're going to see those sort of those are really big problems in data. And I think there's some emerging technology there, really, that was built out of the GraphQL community that's going to help those sort of things start happening. But you're exactly right. If data is wrong, that's a big problem, Corey. And this is not a layer to be looked at lightly or to be treated lightly. And I think it's all part of infrastructure. I think infrastructure is servers and load balancers and all this crazy stuff that you all talk about. But like our application infrastructure, I feel the surface area is typically at the database because it's such a key component of the entire stack.
Exactly. There have been a few comments now talking about running these things in different places, about at the edge and about Kubernetes. Can I run this database at the edge where internet connectivity is not always granted? Yeah, as an open source project, I can answer that for you. If not, you're doing something horrifying. I mean, there needs to be connectivity, presumably, between what you want to talk to the database and the database itself, but there's nothing saying that those things need to be on the general internet. If the answer to that is different, then we are about to have a whole horrifying conversation. The people also wondering about when distributed doesn't mean you need to plug it in. In other words, like for example, outposts need to be syncing to a region at least, I think, once every 6 hours, or they no longer are outposts. They're now basically the air conditioner ballast, for lack of a better term. And people talk about about a bunch of other ideas as well. Let's bring us to EKS Anywho, or Anywhere, or whatever it is that they're calling it this week. The idea that great, now I can take EKS, a Kubernetes distribution, and run it anywhere. Now, my immediate response to that is, oh, thank God, we're no longer tied to the tyranny of only being able to run Kubernetes on AWS. I have some challenges to that thought, but now that you have effectively a single maintenance approach, being able to have that control plane in other places, what is this? Is this an attempt to undermine OpenShift? Not that it needs the help. What is it?
Yeah, I think it's a direct competitor. I think it's directly at OpenShift, honestly. Kubernetes is going to run everywhere, anywhere, y'all. It's what the stuff they put around it in their own distribution in terms of, how it runs within, the AWS 4 walls or 8,000 walls or whatever they have, And so it's basically a opinionated view of running Kubernetes, of which if they get developers going off and building things and architects building things on their opinionated view, they got you, and you're going to run it in EKS because it's easy to do that. That's wonderful and that's interesting. I think this is a similar strategy to what's happening at OpenShift. I think OpenShift is doing some interesting things that are in the general open source world of Kubernetes and contributing back to that project. Most notably, things around like rolling upgrades and automatically updating the Kubernetes control plane itself. That was a lot of work that was going on at CoreOS when I was there, and their purchase, Red Hat's purchase of CoreOS was interesting because it was the original concept of that company was how do I create an iOS like version of the OS where it just upgrades. Like if there's a problem, it just upgrades itself, and to me that's a really really cool thing. So, but it creates an opinionated view of the platform, and so to me it's an opinionated view which creates lock and ties people in, which is part and parcel of a strategy of any large cloud provider, I think. And so I find the whole thing to be reminiscent of, I was in the Hadoop game for a while, and we were selling a Hortonworks, a Hadoop distribution at Hortonworks. And so and it was opinionated, but it kept people in your world. And it's part of that, that adoption model of open source software.
The value of Kubernetes cannot be understated or overstated or even stated, because every time I talk to someone who's doing Kubernetes, they start talking in platitudes or resume development or whatnot. It's very rare that I see a compelling business case for it. And someone asked a few minutes ago, which aligns directly with this, can you share your thoughts about the convergence of serverless and containers? And I have thoughts on that, but I want to start with you.
Okay, I'll start with what's the value of Kubernetes, and I think one of the problems with Kubernetes is still the intelligentsia that's talking about Kubernetes, and nobody really wants to distill it down into the true value of what it actually probably does. Beyond that, not many organizations really understand the concept of an SRE and like how scripting and dealing with backend compute. I mean, these are concepts that are difficult to understand, and it's going to take years for our industry to really get our heads around it because it's a paradigm shift. I believe we are going through that paradigm shift to distributed systems because that is what's the natural capability of the cloud, of being able to be truly elastic, being able to be available all the time, global, and being able to meet the needs of people all over the planet. And I think, we're going through a paradigm shift. So I think, first of all, there's that. And I think that resulting goal and this concept of containers and serverless, I guess containers are a enabling technology to get us to an overall vision of what serverless is. Kubernetes might be an enabling technology to get us to the point what serverless ends up being, 5 to 6 to 7 years ago. Hopefully, I'm done. I'm getting old here, man. So, but I think I think we're on a path to that ultimate goal because there is value in this. I mean, Corey, we just spoke about it. Wouldn't it be great if I could just spin instances up and down and get my utilization bill way down so I just don't have things on all the time? I think that's what we all want. Getting there is really, really difficult. I think we see where we want to be. We see the components are being put in place. We just aren't there yet. I think we sometimes think we are. We just aren't.
Yeah, 20 years ago, you would be paid about, well, damn close anyway, to what a Kubernetes engineer would be paid today. But back then, instead of being a Kubernetes engineer, you were a network firewall engineer because it was that arcane and that difficult to understand. These days, it's a couple of checkboxes somewhere, and there are very few direct firewall engineering roles. This stuff simplifies over time. Right now, we're in early days where it's the thought leaders of tomorrow and a bunch of people who want to cosplay as Google SREs who are seriously into this. But a lot of the demos are, here's how you run your blog on top of Kubernetes, and it's too much for an awful lot of actual business use cases. Now, EKS is fascinating, along at the simultaneous launch of ECS Anywhere, where the idea of, you can run their actual, Kubernetes, except for people with a business problem who want to be able to orchestrate containers in a bunch of different places. I think it's a really interesting strategic shift. A few years ago, there were strong stipulations about even mentioning the existence of other clouds, that you might want to run something somewhere else. And now it seems like it's a complete strategy shift as AWS is coming out of the regions and into the places where customers tend to live. And I don't feel that that's aimed at the Twitter for Pets companies that I like to start and run, but at the big blue chips who are going to evaluate something, and a fast deployment takes 5 to 7 years.
That's right. I think, honestly, personally, I just think AWS is waking up to the pragmatic reality that people are going to live in different places, and you can't just control the whole thing. And in fact, the more you give people room to roam, the more they're going to be with you. And, I love that as a philosophy in life. Like, put your fences way out in the field, your herd will stick with you. And I think that's the learnings that they've had over the past couple of years. I think controlling the entire ecosystem is interesting. I see it in the amount of services they have. They give, who uses every one of those services? You said it yourself. Are you kidding me? No way. But they give everybody enough so that they do find what they need. And then if you give them the freedom to actually develop and do things where they need to, I think people will just keep coming back. And I think I like what they're doing. Honestly, I think it's smart, and I think developers, at least the developers I know, and again, I'm more one of these kind of open sourcey people, is we don't want to be tied to anything, but we will be tied to it if it's of value to me. And I think knowing that I can escape is what's important.
Absolutely. Having a theoretical exodus makes you feel better about not actually exiting anything. I also think that at some point, AWS had a soul-searching moment of, do we want to be right, or do we want to help customers? And you can also, if you want to be less charitable, equate that last one to, do we want to be right, or do we want to make an absolute shit ton of money? and they mention it's a $46 billion business, the next $46 billion is not going to come from the same places as the first $46 billion. You have to find a way to reach people where they are. Now, I question whether having 200 services, 40 of them all starting with the word IoT, is necessarily the best way to approach a lot of those businesses. But again, what do I know? It's easier to make fun of things than it is to build them correctly, which is basically my entire existence in a nutshell.
Right. I think 12 of them are named SageMaker, aren't they? Or like 14, 15 of them?
It's hard to tell because they redid their SageMaker landing page. And it used to have like just a list of all the different subservices, and you look at it and, oh, this is clearly more complicated than I could get into. They streamline that experience and it becomes much more clear. I think SageMaker Studio is where they're pushing people now, and then there are different capabilities exposed underneath it. But again, Amazon has always been willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time, and that goes double for AWS marketing.
But it's still being adopted, and I think they're still building tools that people find useful and very easy to adopt, and that's great. For somebody like us in these kind of the ISVs that are kind of doing things outside of that big environment of adoption, we want to push we're going to continue to push the envelope, and I think that's why you see so much investment in small companies. I think you see the valuations in some of the recent IPOs of infrastructure type companies. We are pushing the limits, and we are pushing it in a way that is interesting for the next 3 to 5 to 10 years. And I think the larger cloud providers, AWS included, they'll be laggards, but they're fine because there's this whole concept of the late majority that buys a lot of stuff. The whole Jeffrey Moore kind of crossing the chasm thing, and they squarely align to that, and they're going to make a lot of money doing those things. We're going to drive new markets and build huge, massive categories along the way that can actually help disrupt and push them in ways as well. And that's, I think, the back and forth between large vendor and small startup continues, man. And I love that's the world I live in. I love it. So
I think that there's a tremendous story somewhere for folks who are able to tie a lot of these different components and these different building blocks into unified stories. And that's something I don't think we're seeing a lot of yet. I'm optimistic about the future, but today it still requires an awful lot of tea leaf reading.
Yeah. And it was funny. I was talking internally on our team, and we were talking about different types of people who develop applications. And I think what AWS has done is they made it real easy for people to actually develop. Like, I can pull together a bunch of different components now, which I think is really interesting. And I think that allows people to be creative with the problem they're trying to solve if they have the right tools behind them to actually build it. There's still room for advanced developers, and there's still there's software engineers who build those things that people use to develop. They aren't the same type of developer. And so I think we're just seeing the emergence of, is it plug and play abstracted components of technology that are just pulled together that are so easy a marketing guy can actually build something. I think we're getting there. You see things like Retool, you see things like, there's a couple of these like no code platforms. I think it's all moving that direction so we can actually, deliver on the creativity that's in each of our heads, and make the tools simple enough so that they're abstracted and just work with each other. I love that part of this whole kind of big platform thing. I don't like big platforms though, because I like my freedom.
Oh, it's my favorite part. It's the reason I'm not really using it into Kubernetes. Is I'm always a fan of making technology more accessible, not more rarefied. And I want to see people able to achieve outcomes, business or otherwise, in as little work as possible. So click button, receive happiness. How do you reduce the mean time to dopamine?
That's right.
We're heading in that direction, but we're absolutely not there yet.
Yeah. It'll be an interesting couple years, I think.
So thank you so much for taking the time to, I guess, basically suffer my slings, arrows, etc. today. If people want to hear more about what you're up to, how you view the world, maybe you have something to sell them perhaps, where can they find you?
It's just cockroachlabs.com. Pretty much everything we talk about is there. We're just a believer everything's digital. So I just push everybody to cockroachlabs.com. If you want to start and use Cockroach Cloud is a great way to get started. We give away free clusters. Watch this space for a lot more news to make this really extremely available to everybody. over the next couple months. We got some exciting stuff coming
Excellent
up.
marketing decision, by the way, to not do big releases during reInvent. Every year I get PR emails of, we're releasing this big thing at reInvent. Oh, are you really? Are you, I don't know, going to be doing it on stage next to Andy Jassy? Because if not, the only thing you should be announcing is your data breach, because no one is going to be paying attention. Now, it's a bit harder to do that this year over the 3 weeks. Like putting a 3-week moratorium on everything is a bit of a heavy lift. But good on you for not doing the announcement, like timing it at the same time as the keynote or whatnot, like I saw a couple other folks doing. Are you just actively ashamed of this, or do you want us to think you are?
With age comes a couple of things. I may not know what to do, Corey. There's always new ways of doing things. There's certain things you just don't do, and that's compete with a big show by a particular vendor like an AWS. Yeah, when it was a week, it was kind of easier, but they've really blacked out. Basically, they just dotted out the sun of the entire month of December for everybody, basically here. Because we are on it's day 86 now of reInvent. We started this day 85, so we're getting there.
Yeah, Google did it with Cloud Next over 9 weeks. It was just basically not really a conference so much as it was just a bunch of YouTube dumps every Tuesday. And that's fine because A, people can get around that, and 2, people don't seem to care as much today about GCP as they do AWS, so that may be changing. And by diluting it out, it becomes a little weird. What I wasn't expecting was the stop-start cadence of the announcements for these 3 weeks of reInvent. Where I thought it was going to be announcement after announcement all day, every day. No, they'll drop a whole bunch where you scramble to keep up. And then the next day, like today, is crickets, where there are a couple of minor announcements that got out, but nothing massive, nothing headlining. It's a slow business day. And keeping up with that stop-start stagger cadence is, well, it's a challenge for me. And if I'd known, I would have structured things differently. But since when does AWS marketing let us know what they're going to be doing?
I don't know. Don't ask me.
It's a heck of a job. I don't think anyone can, especially people who work there. So thank you once again for taking the time to suffer through me. I'm sorry?
I'm just happy I don't have to walk around the sands this week or last week or, that chaos. That's all. I'm just happy about that part.
Yes, I'm sleeping about the same as I do during normal reInvent, but I'm drinking a lot less and I'm wearing through fewer shoes, which is helpful. So thank you once again for taking the time to join us. You are, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Jim Walker, VP of Product Marketing at Cockroachdb.
Thank you, Corey.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it.